The construction crew stopped digging the moment they heard the sound, a metallic scrape against something that shouldn't have been there. Beneath Cabin 7 at what was once Camp Whispering Pines, 3 feet down in the Pennsylvania clay, they found it. A tarnished silver bracelet with the initials MK etched into its surface. The foreman recognized it immediately from the missing person posters that had papered the county 25 years earlier. Melissa Keller vanished on August 14, 1998, during the final night of summer camp. One moment, she was conducting a midnight bed check. The next, she was gone, leaving behind only questions and a community that never stopped looking. The case went cold. The camp closed 2 years later. The forest reclaimed what remained. But last summer, when developers broke ground to renovate the property, they discovered something that changed everything. The bracelet was just the beginning. Wrapped around it was a piece of fabric, canvas, investigators determined, from a tent that was never supposed to be at that location. And pressed into the hardened clay beside it was the faint impression of a handprint, small and desperate, preserved like a fossil for a quarter century. What happened to Melissa Keller during those final hours at Camp Whispering Pines? Why was evidence of her last moments buried directly beneath the cabin she was assigned to supervise? And what else lies hidden in the soil where children once roasted marshmallows and sang songs around the fire? If you're fascinated by mysteries that refuse to stay buried, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Leave a comment below with your theories about what really happened that August night. And if you make it to the end, you'll discover why sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that were hidden in plain sight all along. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare began, to a summer that started with so much promise. Camp Whispering Pines opened its gates for the 53rd summer on June 15, 1998. Nestled in the Allegheny foothills of western Pennsylvania, the camp had earned a reputation for traditional outdoor education. No televisions, no phones, just 200 acres of forest, 3 pristine lakes, and a philosophy that children needed to disconnect from the modern world to discover themselves. Melissa Keller arrived early that year, 3 days before the first campers. At 22, she was beginning her 3rd season as a senior counselor, responsible for Cabin 7, a weathered structure that housed 8 girls aged 13 to 14. Her friends described her as conscientious to the point of anxiety, the type of person who triple-checked cabin rosters and kept detailed logs of every activity. Her younger sister would later tell investigators that Melissa treated her counselor duties like a sacred trust. The staff orientation that June seemed unremarkable. 60 counselors, mostly college students, gathered in the main lodge while camp director Robert Finnegan outlined the summer schedule. Swimming lessons, archery tournaments, overnight camping trips to the northern section of the property, where the old growth forest still stood. Melissa took notes in the margins of her handbook, underlining the emergency protocols with characteristic thoroughness. But something was different that summer, though it wouldn't become apparent until much later. The camp had made a significant change to its layout, due to foundation issues discovered during the spring. Cabin 7 had been relocated approximately 40 feet from its original position, moved closer to the tree line, farther from the central compound. The adjustment seemed minor at the time. The cabin still had the same bunk beds, the same screened windows, the same wooden sign hanging above the door. What nobody realized was that the new location placed Cabin 7 directly above something that had been deliberately concealed decades earlier. Melissa's campers arrived on June 20th, 8 girls from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg, excited for 2 months of freedom. There was Sarah Brennan, whose parents were going through a divorce, Katie Morrison, who'd begged for months to return to the camp she loved, Emma Delgado, quiet and artistic, who spent her free time sketching the forest. The other 5 blended into the typical chaos of summer camp life, homesickness that lasted 3 days, friendships that formed over shared secrets, the universal experience of growing up away from home. The summer progressed exactly as summers should. Melissa led her cabin through all the traditional milestones. They learned to identify poison ivy, and build proper campfires. They capsized canoes during water games and sang off-key during evening assemblies. In her personal journal, recovered by investigators years later, Melissa wrote that Cabin 7 had developed an unusually strong bond. "They feel like family," she noted on July 18th. "I've never had a group this connected." But Melissa had begun noticing things that troubled her, small disturbances she initially dismissed as coincidence. Items going missing from the cabin, a hairbrush, a journal, a pair of sneakers, only to reappear days later in unexpected locations. Strange sounds beneath the floorboards during late-night hours, scratching noises that didn't match any animal she knew. A persistent cold spot near the back corner of the cabin, even during the humid Pennsylvania summer. She mentioned these oddities only once, during a casual conversation with fellow counselor David Martinez on August 3rd. "I think we might have a raccoon problem under Cabin 7, she said, laughing it off. "Either that or my girls are playing elaborate pranks on each other." David suggested she file a maintenance request. Melissa said she would handle it after the camp session ended. She was already thinking ahead to the closing ceremonies, to saying goodbye to her campers, to returning to her senior year at Penn State. The future seemed so certain, so mapped out. She had 11 days left. To understand what happened at Camp Whispering Pines, you need to understand what existed on that land long before children arrived with sleeping bags and flashlights. The property was originally settled in 1847 by a Lutheran congregation that established a small retreat center they called Friedenshütte, Peace Sanctuary. For 30 years, it served as a quiet place of worship and reflection. But in 1877, the congregation abandoned the site abruptly, leaving behind only cryptic references in church records to disturbances of the spirit and ground that refuses blessing. The land changed hands multiple times over the next 60 years. A lumber company tried to log the property in 1893, but abandoned operations after only 3 months. Their foreman reported that workers refused to enter certain sections of the forest, claiming they heard voices when no one was there. A private family purchased the acreage in 1921 and attempted to build a residence, but construction stopped after the foundation collapsed twice in the same location. The builders insisted the ground seemed unstable, though geological surveys showed nothing unusual about the soil composition. Then, in 1938, the property was sold to the newly formed Camp Whispering Pines Association, established by a group of educators who believed in the transformative power of outdoor experience. They constructed the main lodge, cleared trails, built simple cabins along the lakefront. For a decade, everything went smoothly. The camp thrived. Children came home with stories of friendship and adventure. But in the summer of 1949, something happened that the camp worked desperately to keep quiet. A 12-year-old camper named Thomas Whitmore disappeared during an overnight camping trip. He was last seen walking toward the latrine around midnight. When counselors noticed he was missing at breakfast, they organized an immediate search. State police, volunteers, and tracking dogs combed every inch of the property. After 4 days, they found Thomas wandering near the northern boundary, confused and unable to explain where he'd been. He kept repeating that he'd been underground, though no caves or significant excavations existed in that area. Thomas refused to speak about the experience afterward. His parents withdrew him from camp immediately and declined all media requests. The official report stated he'd gotten disoriented in the dark and sheltered in a hollow log. But counselors who were present that summer later admitted, off the record years later, that something had fundamentally changed in Thomas. He wouldn't sleep without lights on. He checked under his bed compulsively. When he looked at certain photographs from camp, they said, he would start crying without explanation. The camp administration responded by establishing new rules. No overnight trips to the northern section, no unsupervised access to certain areas, and, crucially, no discussion of the Thomas Whitmore incident with new staff or campers. The event was sealed in old filing cabinets, mentioned only in whispers between directors who'd been there long enough to remember. When Melissa Keller arrived in 1996 for her first summer as a junior counselor, nobody told her about Thomas Whitmore. Nobody explained why certain trails were officially closed for environmental preservation. Nobody mentioned that Cabin 7's original location had been specifically chosen to keep it far from the northern tree line where the old-growth forest pressed closest to the camp facilities. And nobody could have predicted that the foundation repairs necessitating Cabin 7's relocation would move it directly over the site where, in 1877, the Lutheran congregation had buried something they believed needed to stay sealed forever. The church records that survived were fragmentary, but one passage was recovered during the investigation following Melissa's disappearance. Written by Reverend Johann Schaefer in September 1877, it read, "We have sealed the entrance and consecrated the ground above it. Let no man dig there. What sleeps below must not be awakened by the innocent. May God forgive us for what we could not destroy, only contain." The camp had no record of this warning. The land surveys conducted in 1938 made no reference to any sealed structures, and when workers relocated Cabin 7 in the spring of 1998, they unknowingly placed 8 teenage girls and their counselor directly above something that had been hidden for 121 years. By August, whatever was beneath the cabin had become aware of the presence above it. The final 2 weeks of August at Camp Whispering Pines followed a cherished tradition. While most campers departed after their scheduled sessions, approximately 50 kids who'd signed up for the full summer remained for what staff called closing camp, a period of relaxed rules, special activities, and the bittersweet countdown to the season's end. Melissa's cabin retained 6 of its original 8 girls. Sarah and Katie had to leave early for family commitments, but the remaining group had grown so close they'd already made plans to reunite during the school year. Emma, the quiet artist, had come out of her shell completely, now leading evening sing-alongs. The bonds formed over those 2 months felt permanent, the kind of friendships that would define their teenage years. But Melissa's journal entries from those final weeks showed increasing concern about conditions in Cabin 7. On August 5th, she wrote, "The scratching beneath the floor is getting worse. I checked with maintenance. They found no evidence of animal activity. Bob, Director Finnegan, suggested it's just the cabin settling into its new foundation. But it's not random. It happens at the same time every night, around 2 a.m., always starting from the back corner." August 8th. Emma saw something last night. She won't describe it clearly, but she insists someone was standing outside our window, looking in. When I checked, there were no footprints in the soft ground. I'm trying to keep the girls calm, but I'm starting to think this cabin should be inspected more thoroughly. August 11th. Items keep disappearing. This morning, my bracelet, the silver one my grandmother gave me, was missing from my nightstand. I found it 2 hours later buried in the dirt under the front steps. I didn't put it there. None of the girls would have done something like that. I don't understand what's happening. David Martinez, Melissa's friend and fellow counselor, noticed the change in her demeanor. She seemed exhausted, he told investigators in 1998. Dark circles under her eyes like she wasn't sleeping. When I asked if everything was okay, she just said the cabin was giving her weird vibes, and she'd be relieved when the summer ended. I wish I'd pushed harder, asked more questions. But we were all tired. That's just how August feels at camp. On August 13th, the day before Melissa's disappearance, something happened that should have triggered immediate alarm. During the afternoon rest period, Emma entered the cabin alone to retrieve a book. She emerged 2 minutes later, pale and shaking, refusing to go back inside. When Melissa pressed her, Emma finally explained. She'd heard a voice coming from beneath the floorboards. Not scratching, not animal sounds. A voice, speaking words she couldn't quite understand, but which filled her with overwhelming dread. Melissa investigated immediately. She crawled under the cabin with a flashlight, searching for any gap or opening that might explain the phenomenon. The space beneath was cramped, barely 2 feet of clearance, filled with undisturbed dirt and the support beams of the new foundation. She found nothing unusual. No holes, no animals, no source for the voice Emma had described. But she did notice something she hadn't seen before. in the back corner, where the scratching sounds always originated, the dirt appeared darker, more compact, as if something substantial had been buried there and the ground had been disturbed relatively recently. She scraped at the surface with her hand, breaking through a thin crust, and her fingers touched something solid beneath. Before she could investigate further, the dinner bell rang, and her campers needed supervision. "I'll look again tomorrow," she wrote in her journal that evening, "after the kids are asleep. Something's definitely under there, and I want to know what it is before we close the cabin for the season. It's probably just old construction debris," but Emma's reaction really bothered me. She's not the type to make up stories. Those were the last words Melissa Keller ever wrote. That night, August 13th, was humid and still. The girls in Cabin 7 fell asleep quickly, exhausted from a day of swimming and hiking. Melissa sat on her counselor's bunk, reading by flashlight, determined to stay awake until she was certain all her campers were deeply asleep. Around midnight, she closed her book and quietly slipped outside. David Martinez saw her walking toward the maintenance shed, presumably to get better tools for investigating beneath the cabin. She waved at him. He waved back. She disappeared behind the building. That was the last confirmed sighting of Melissa Keller alive. The first indication that something was wrong came at 6:30 a.m. on August 14th, when the wake-up bell rang and Melissa didn't emerge from Cabin 7. The girls inside stirred awake to find their counselor's bunk empty, her flashlight still on, her journal lying open to that final page. Emma checked the bathroom. Nothing. Another camper looked in the lodge. Melissa wasn't at breakfast prep. Within 20 minutes, David Martinez alerted Director Finnegan, and the camp shifted into emergency protocol. Counselors fanned out across the property while all campers were gathered in the main lodge under supervision. By noon, when Melissa still hadn't appeared, local police were called. By evening, the search had expanded to include state police, K-9 units, and volunteer teams from surrounding communities. They found no trace of her beyond the maintenance shed, no footprints leading into the forest, no signs of struggle, no indication that she'd left the camp property at all. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 months. FBI agents interviewed every counselor and camper. They searched every building, every trail, every possible hiding place within the 200 acres. They drained portions of the lakes. They examined Melissa's background exhaustively, searching for any reason she might have left voluntarily. They found nothing but a responsible young woman who loved her job and had every reason to finish out the summer and return to college. The media attention was intense. "Where is Melissa?" became a regional obsession. Her parents gave emotional press conferences. Her sister organized searches that continued long after official efforts wound down. Psychics called with tips. Conspiracy theorists proposed elaborate scenarios, but no concrete evidence emerged to explain what happened during those hours between midnight and dawn. The camp never recovered. Enrollment plummeted in 1999. By 2000, Camp Whispering Pines closed permanently, unable to shake the association with tragedy. The property sat abandoned for 2 decades, gradually deteriorating, becoming the subject of local urban legends about ghost counselors and cursed cabins. But here's what investigators missed in 1998, details that only became apparent when the bracelet was discovered last year, and a cold case team reviewed everything with fresh eyes. First, Melissa's journal. The final entry mentioned investigating under the cabin after the kids are asleep. But investigators in 1998 focused on her movements after leaving the cabin, not on what might have drawn her attention beneath it in the first place. Nobody checked under Cabin 7's floorboards during the initial search. The space was too tight, too obviously empty to human eyes, and search dogs showed no interest in the area. Second, Emma's testimony about hearing a voice was dismissed as teenage imagination amplified by trauma. The investigators' notes literally include the phrase, "unreliable witness," clearly upset. No one took seriously the possibility that something beneath the cabin had actually been calling out. Third, and most critically, Nobody in 1998 knew about the Lutheran congregation's 1877 records because those documents were held in a seminary archive in Pittsburgh that wouldn't be digitized and made searchable until 2016. The warning about sealed ground meant nothing to investigators who didn't know it existed. The cold case team that reopened the investigation last summer started with a significant advantage. They had the bracelet, the fabric fragment, and the handprint in the clay. But they also had something else: ground-penetrating radar technology that didn't exist in 1998. When they scanned the area beneath where Cabin 7 had stood, they found something that changed everything. 4 feet below the surface, directly where Melissa's bracelet had been buried, the radar revealed a void space, not a natural formation, something man-made, approximately 6 feet by 6 feet, with straight walls and what appeared to be a stone ceiling. The team submitted requests to excavate. Local authorities, wary of disturbing what might be a crime scene or burial site, proceeded carefully. On October 3, 2024, 26 years and 2 months after Melissa disappeared, excavation began beneath what used to be Cabin 7. What they uncovered explained everything and nothing at all. The void space turned out to be a stone chamber, meticulously constructed with hand-cut blocks, mortared together with techniques common in the mid-1800s. The entrance, which had been sealed with a concrete plug and blessed with religious symbols carved into its surface, had developed a crack sometime in the decades after 1877. Not a large crack, barely 3 inches wide, but significant enough that someone beneath could potentially reach through if they pressed against it with sufficient force. Inside the chamber, forensic teams found evidence that made the lead investigator physically ill. Scratch marks on the interior walls, concentrated around the crack in the seal. Not old marks. Recent ones, cutting through decades of accumulated dust. Chemical analysis dated them to approximately 1998. They also found Melissa's flashlight, its batteries long dead, lying on the stone floor. Her sneakers, removed and placed neatly against the wall. And, most disturbing, her camp shirt, folded carefully, bearing traces of soil that matched the clay composition above the chamber. But Melissa herself wasn't there. The chamber was empty except for those few personal items. What was there? Carved into every visible surface of the stone walls were symbols. Hundreds of them, covering the chamber from floor to ceiling. Some were clearly religious. Crosses, ichthys, symbols, Latin phrases related to sealing and binding. But others were older, predating Christian iconography entirely, speaking to traditions that stretched back to when European settlers first encountered this land. A historian specializing in Pennsylvania Dutch folk practices examined photographs of the carvings. Her assessment was sobering. This chamber was designed as a seal. The symbols aren't decorative, they're functional, meant to contain something. The Lutheran congregation who built this clearly believed they were trapping something they couldn't destroy. The question isn't what was sealed inside. The question is, what got out when the seal cracked? But the forensic evidence told a more complex story. The DNA recovered from the chamber belonged exclusively to Melissa. There was no indication that anyone or anything else had ever occupied the space. The scratch marks on the walls matched the dimensions of human fingernails. The soil under her shirt matched what would have been present if she'd been digging or crawling through the confined space beneath the cabin. The positioning of her belongings suggested something even more disturbing. They'd been arranged deliberately, almost ritualistically. The flashlight pointing toward the crack in the seal, the shoes aligned with the cardinal directions, the shirt folded with a precision that spoke of careful attention despite presumably traumatic circumstances. Forensic psychologists proposed a theory. Melissa had discovered the crack in the seal, perhaps when she investigated beneath the cabin that final night. Something about it had compelled her, whether curiosity, compulsion, or something else, to widen the opening and enter the chamber. Once inside, in the dark, in that confined space filled with century-old warnings carved in stone, she'd experienced a psychological break. Panic, disorientation, the overwhelming terror of being trapped underground. But this theory couldn't explain the most troubling piece of evidence. The fabric wrapped around Melissa's bracelet wasn't from a tent, as initially reported. Further analysis revealed it was canvas from a vintage sleeping bag manufactured between 1945 and 1952. The same type of sleeping bag that would have been standard equipment at Camp Whispering Pines in 1949. When investigators cross-referenced their findings with the old Thomas Whitmore incident, they discovered something that none of them wanted to acknowledge officially. Thomas's family had donated his camp belongings to the camps lost and found in 1950, hoping another child might use them. Among those items was a sleeping bag that had never been claimed or redistributed, a sleeping bag that should have been in the camp's storage shed, not buried beneath a cabin that wouldn't be relocated to that site for another 48 years. The lead investigator included this information in his final report with a note. The presence of the 1949-era sleeping bag material in the 1998 burial site suggests either extensive premeditation by an unknown party with historical knowledge of the camp, or a temporal anomaly that current forensic science cannot adequately explain. Off the record, he said something different to reporters. Something was under that cabin, something that had been waiting since 1877. The Lutheran congregation tried to seal it away, but seals don't last forever. Thomas Whitmore encountered it in 1949 and escaped. Melissa Keller encountered it in 1998. She didn't. The official ruling on Melissa Keller's disappearance was updated from missing person to death by unknown causes. Her bracelet and personal items were returned to her family. The chamber was resealed, this time with modern materials and without the religious symbolism that had marked the original. But questions remained that no investigation could answer. Where is Melissa's body? How did she leave the chamber if her belongings were left inside? And what exactly was that Lutheran congregation trying to contain in 1877? The property that once housed Camp Whispering Pines sits empty today. The development plans were quietly canceled after the discovery beneath Cabin 7. The land has been designated as a historical preservation site, though no signs explain what's being preserved or why. A chain-link fence surrounds the perimeter. Security cameras monitor for trespassers. And every year on August 14th, people gather at the locked gate. Melissa's family, former campers and counselors, local residents who remember when children's laughter echoed through those woods. Emma Delgado, now 40 years old, has spoken publicly only once about that summer. In an interview for a podcast documenting the case, she said, "I heard the voice, and I knew immediately that we weren't alone in that cabin. Something was aware of us. Something had been alone for so long, and it was reaching out. I think Melissa heard it too, and unlike me, she didn't run away. She tried to help. That's who she was. Someone who protected people, who investigated problems instead of ignoring them. And I think that's what got her killed or taken or whatever happened to her in that chamber." Thomas Whitmore died in 2019 without ever publicly discussing his experience in 1949. But his daughter, while settling his estate, found a letter he'd written and sealed with instructions that it be opened only after his death. The letter was brief. "I was underground for 4 days in 1949. I wasn't lost. I was kept. Something beneath Camp Whispering Pines feeds on presence, on attention, on the awareness of those above. It called to me, and I went. It would have kept me forever, but I was a child. And something about innocence protected me. When I finally escaped, I could feel it trying to hold me back, could hear it promising things if I'd just stay a little longer. I ran. I never went back. But I never forgot the voice, and I've spent my whole life wondering who it would call to next." The FBI maintains an open file on the Melissa Keller case. Occasionally, tips still come in. Alleged sightings, conspiracy theories, paranormal enthusiasts convinced they've solved the mystery. None have led anywhere meaningful. The truth, if there is a singular truth, remains buried somewhere between documented fact and inexplicable phenomenon. But here's what keeps investigators awake at night. During the excavation last summer, after they'd removed Melissa's belongings and documented every inch of the chamber, they discovered one final detail. On the newest section of stone, where the crack in the seal had been, someone had carved fresh symbols, not with ancient tools or weathered hands. Recently, within the last 25 years. The symbols were analyzed by multiple experts. The consensus was disturbing. They were instructions, written in a hybrid of German and Pennsylvania Dutch, explaining how to open the seal from the inside. A guide for escape, carved by someone who'd been trapped below and wanted to ensure others would know the way out. The handwriting matched samples from Melissa's journal, which means at some point after August 14th, 1998, Melissa Keller was alive inside that chamber long enough to carve directions for her own escape. But the chamber was sealed. The crack was only 3 inches wide, and her body has never been found. The final question, the one that haunts everyone connected to this case, is simple and terrible. If Melissa found a way out of the chamber, where did she go? And if something that had been sealed since 1877 was released when she opened that crack, where is it now? The camp is gone. The cabins have been demolished. The land sits quiet and still, returning slowly to forest. But sometimes, late at night, security footage from the cameras surrounding the property captures something the monitoring company can't explain. Movement near where Cabin 7 once stood. A figure, distant and indistinct, walking the perimeter as if conducting one final bed check before lights out. The footage is always too grainy to identify features. The timestamps always read 2:00 a.m., the same time Melissa's campers used to hear scratching beneath their floor. And whenever investigators review the recordings, they notice the same unsettling detail. The figure casts no shadow, even under the bright security lights. Melissa Keller's family continues to search for answers. Her sister visits the site regularly, leaving flowers at the gate, hoping for closure that may never come. And on warm summer nights, when the wind moves through what used to be Camp Whispering Pines, local residents swear they can still hear it. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of children singing camp songs, and beneath it, just barely audible, a voice calling from somewhere underground, asking if anyone is listening. Some seals were never meant to be broken. Some places were meant to remain forgotten. And some people who go looking for answers discover that certain questions were never supposed to be asked at all. The bracelet sits in an evidence locker in Pittsburgh. The chamber sits resealed beneath Pennsylvania soil. And somewhere between the known and the unknowable, Melissa Keller exists in the space reserved for mysteries that refuse to be solved. A young woman who tried to protect the innocent, who investigated when others looked away, who opened something that had been closed for 121 years. We may never know what happened in those hours between midnight and dawn. But we know this. Sometimes the ground beneath our feet holds secrets that were buried for good reason. And sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is dig them up. If you're still watching, if you've made it this far, remember this. The next time you hear something strange beneath your floorboards, the next time you feel watched in an empty room, the next time something that was lost suddenly reappears in a place it shouldn't be, think of Melissa Keller. Think of a young woman who went to investigate. Think about what might be waiting in the spaces we've forgotten to seal, and maybe, just maybe, leave it buried.